Hello, everyone. The time is 3:34 p.m. This is the October 22nd, 2024 meeting of the Long-Term Revenue Advisory Council. We will go ahead and start the meeting with the roll call attendance. We will start with the voting members and we will go in alphabetical order. So if you are present, just go ahead and say aye or present. Lorenzo Boyd.
Present.
Ryan Coleman.
Present.
Nancy Cross.
Present.
Jason Fletcher.
Present.
Treasurer Adam Lane. Sam Murphy.
Present.
Linda Nguyen.
Present.
Paul Payne.
Present.
Danielle Scott Parker.
Present.
Mark Stoff.
Present.
And Tracy Verner.
Present.
All right, and then ex officio members, Assessor Michael Dauphin. Let's see, I see him on the screen here, so we'll go ahead and put him down as present. And then Rebecca Perry Glickstein.
Present.
Great. All right. And then we do have a slight amendment to the agenda to consider putting forward this for consideration of amending the agenda to add an item to discuss and approve. Oh, thank you, Assessor Dauphin. Got that noted. To discuss, review, and approve the draft minutes from the September 12th, 2024 meeting. Is there any discussion of considering that motion before we identify someone to make it? Okay, hearing that, is there anybody who would like to, oh, Nancy, you went off mute. Did you want to bring
I'll
something
make the
forward?
motion.
Great. Motion has been The motion has been made and seconded to review and approve the draft minutes from the September 12th, 2024 meeting. We'll go ahead and pause to allow folks to take a quick look at those if they have not been able to already. And if there's any amendments or changes to bring forward at the end of about the next minute or so, we'll go ahead and note those down and get those changed.
Minor
Just for
detail,
discussion.
but my last name is spelled Nguyen.
Got it. So sorry about that. I will go ahead and make sure that is updated.
Just remember, there's always a guy inside my middle name. That's how I like to remind you.
Very helpful. Thank you.
For my last name, there's no hyphen. It's just Scott Parker.
Just Scott Parker. Okay, thank you so much.
I just want to note that on the substance that these are really great minutes. This will be really helpful to use as sort of to go back and review what we've talked about rather than just sort of a counting of the votes. So thank you for your work on that, Casey.
Sure. Happy to do it. Thank you.
Well, if others are still reviewing, I'll go ahead and move that we approve these or accept these minutes from September 12th.
Second.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you. Right. So the motion is on the table. We'll go ahead and do a quick vote. All those in favor of the approval of the draft minutes with the recommended and requested changes, which include updating the spelling of Linda Nguyen's last name and Danielle Scott Parker's last name throughout, please say aye.
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 Okay. All those opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Well, thank you very much for that. And now we will pivot to the real item of interest today, which is our briefing by the St. Louis Federal Reserve The focus of the briefing is going to be on the city's areas of economic strengths, weaknesses, trends and opportunities and demographics that are of interest as this group considers the landscape and how it might think about the city's long-term revenue. Our presenter is Mr. Chuck, is it Gascon or Gasson? Gascon?
You got that right.
Gascon.
Yep.
Mr. Gascon. And then, of course, we also have Laura Taylor with us today, who is their governmental relations advisor as well. So, Mr. Gascon, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with a quick background, and then we will turn the floor over to you to dive into your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm a regional economist and officer in the research department here at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. I monitor economic conditions around our 8th Federal Reserve District, which is a 7-state region with our headquarter office being here in St. Louis. We also have offices in Little Rock, Louisville, Memphis, and we kind of split the state, broadly speaking, with the Kansas City Fed, our colleagues on the western side of the state. So I'm happy to be here and answer your questions. I'll provide kind of a high-level overview of some of the key drivers I see going on in the regional economy, and then I'm happy to dive into more details on some of the things that I've covered here, or if there's things I haven't presented that you would like to talk about, I'm happy to answer questions on those topics as well. If it's okay with you, I will load up my slides and we can dive into the content.
Sounds great.
Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. You good?
Yep.
I lost it. Okay, well, thank you. Okay, well, so to start out, these are my own views. They're not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Federal Reserve System. So this is all ultimately on me, and these are my own opinions. To the point where I just sent Laura the slides a couple minutes ago so she could look them over. The outline I'm going to go through today is really just to start at a high-level overview of the U.S. economic outlook. And then I want to talk a little bit about how I think about the regional economy, which I think is really important when we think about the role of the city within the broader region. Then I'll dive into some longer run trends on population and labor force, income and housing, and then business sector activity and employment. And then I want to wrap up with some market forecasts just to kind of give a baseline as to where professional forecasters are expecting the region's economy to evolve over the next couple of years. And then I'll wrap up with a conclusion. So just an update in one slide. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the U.S. economy, but I think it's important to set that as a foundation, as the business cycle in the region very much follows the U.S. business cycle, and that's important for understanding the city's finances and the finances of many households in the community. So, at a really high level, the economy has been growing at or slightly above the long-run trend rate of growth over the last couple of years. I'll show you a table here in a second, but U.S. GDP growth was about 3% last year. And it has slowed down from the elevated rates that we saw coming out of the pandemic, but really still running at a pretty healthy rate. On the labor market side of things, job growth is still pretty consistent with a healthy economy. There are a lot of reports that we're hearing from businesses around the St. Louis area that they have fewer job openings than maybe they had a year ago. And they're also experiencing less employer turnover. So there's definitely a sign of kind of easing in labor market conditions, but still a really healthy labor market when you look at the aggregate job gains that we're seeing in the economy. And then with respect to wage growth, it's returning to normal. It's not really back to 2019 levels yet, and it is elevated in some sectors of the economy. But there is some evidence that maybe there's also stronger productivity growth in the economy today that may explain why we still see some stronger than average wage growth numbers. But overall, the labor market is performing quite well. Inflation pressures are continuing to ease. The last inflation report came out a little bit better, a little bit higher than many expected, but still, showing this disinflationary trend. Where we still see elevated inflationary pressures is predominantly in the services side of the economy, so non-housing services, and then also in the housing side of the economy, which is primarily in rents. So that's kind of the high level overview of where we're seeing it on the inflation front in the data today. As I mentioned when I started this, when I look at the aggregate industry mix for the St. Louis metropolitan area, which I'll talk about here in a second, it is very similar to the nation, and that's unique for a lot of places in the middle of the country. We do have a little bit more of a concentration in a few areas such as healthcare, but generally speaking, it matches up pretty closely with the national economy. So the business cycle that we experience here in the region tends to be very similar to the U.S. cycle. So when the U.S. economy is doing pretty well, we typically see pretty healthy job growth in the region. When the economy is contracting, we often see that as a slowdown in economic activity. Structurally, and I'll talk about this in a lot more detail. Some of the real challenges that the regional economy has is an aging population and then this negative net migration that's really resulted in pretty little labor force growth. But with fewer kind of workers entering the labor force, it has less competition for workers. So we see on average lower unemployment rates in the region. So that is a welcome development for those that are looking for work because they have fewer people to compete with. But ultimately, with fewer workers in the workforce, it leads to slower income growth in the aggregates. So it's at a really high level U.S. economy. The FOMC, when they met in September, they released their projections for where they view kind of the appropriate path for the federal funds rate going forward over the next couple of years, as well as the projections for GDP growth, unemployment rate, and inflation. I'm going to outline the median member in this table here. The longer run is really a theoretical construct, but you can kind of think of that as what the trend rate of growth is for the U.S. economy. You can see, again, really strong growth in 2023. 2024, we're still seeing above that longer run trend rate of growth, and tracking forecasts for the third quarter suggest that we may even see stronger growth than what we even expected in September. But that above trend rate of growth is expected to continue. The unemployment rate, again, wage gains have been pretty strong. There has been kind of an easing in labor demand. Some of that is stemming from productivity gains in the economy. As a result of that, the unemployment rate has moved up just a little bit since last year, but still at levels that are very low and consistent with a healthy economy. Here in the St. Louis region, we're still looking at unemployment rates that are well under 4%. On the inflation front, some easing in inflation pressures as we moved into this year. As I mentioned, rent and services side of the economy, still some stickiness there. Insurance is a topic that we hear a lot about from business contacts and community leaders of an area where added inflationary pressures are still existing. But again, moving in the right direction toward the longer run goal of 2% overall inflation. And in order to kind of keep the economy moving on that track, policymakers outlined this path for the Fed funds rate, which was to have an appropriate Fed funds rate of 4.4% at the end of this year and down to 3.4% by the end of next year. So in a lot of ways, the fundamentals of the U.S. economy are really quite strong, and we're seeing easing in inflation pressures. Labor demand has cooled, but it's still a healthy labor market. And in many ways, policymakers convey that their goal is really just to kind of keep this moving forward as we go into the next couple of years. So overall, pretty welcome developments over the course of this year with respect to the overall economy. With that, I want to turn to the regional economy, and I'm really going to focus on a lot of the structural factors in the economy, not as much on the business cycle, because as I mentioned, that's really tied to a lot of what's happening at the national and international developments level. And I want to start by just defining why I want to look beyond just the city of St. Louis and look at the broader metropolitan area. And the reason is that we want to think about this economy as it's a system, right? It's, businesses are producing goods and services. They're using labor, they're using capital from investors, and households are ultimately supplying that labor and in often cases owning these businesses. The role of government in the economy is to provide these public goods and services in exchange for tax payments. In theory, you can kind of close these economic systems where all, people are providing labor or owning businesses. The government's playing a role in there, and it's closed. But in reality, these economies are very open. And when we think about kind of regional economies, the definition that's typically used is a metropolitan statistical area. And that's defined as a geographic area where households live and work. And that's really important when we think about the regional economy and the St. Louis economy, because as I'll show you in some of the data, there are really significant flows as to where people are living in the region, where they're working in the region, and how they're commuting, how those commuting patterns play out. And that creates a lot of economic linkages as to where money is earned, ultimately where it's spent, and how we think about the broader economy. So typically we think about the metropolitan area. So I'll use that as well as the city and some of these comparisons to give you an idea of how we think about the regional economy. So as I mentioned, the St. Louis metro area, and this may be familiar to some of you all, it's a 15 county region spanning Missouri and Illinois. Population is just about 2.8 million people. The majority of the population, though, is located in the 5 core counties that kind of are adjacent to the city of St. Louis. St. Louis County, just under 1 million people. St. Charles County is the next largest with 416,000. And then the city at 281. And then Madison and St. Clair County, just about the same size of the city. So it really is, it's a 15 county region with really the core of our population located in these 5 counties. But those other surrounding counties, while they may not be major employment hubs for the region, a lot of the people in those other surrounding counties are commuting into the central business district, commuting into the city of St. Louis or St. Louis County for work. And that's why the metropolitan area is as broad as it is, because at least half of the population in those counties is commuting into these core counties for work on a daily basis, which is why we think of that as really the regional economy. And just to give you the numbers for St. Louis, this is for 2021. It takes a while for the Labor Department to ultimately go through all this data and put these flows together. But just to give you a really concrete example of what's happening in the region and why it's important to look at the regional economy. So what we have here is worker flows into and out of the city of St. Louis. And what you see is about 155,000 people on a daily basis live outside of the city of St. Louis and are commuting into the city of St. Louis for work. At the same time, there's 73,000 people who live in the city of St. Louis, but are actually employed outside of the city of St. Louis and are commuting to those jobs outside of that area. So actually it leaves a relatively small minority of people who are actually living and working in the same place of, in this case, being the city of St. Louis. You'll see very similar trends if you go onto the census website and pull these kind of maps up, you'll see very similar trends county by county. You can go in occupation by occupation to understand what these flows look like. But it really shows you how close these economic linkages are from one county to another, and why what happens in one part of the region really does have a major impact on the surrounding area. Okay, so turn to some of the longer term trends that we're seeing in the region. I think, and this is probably evident to many of you, but we've seen relatively stagnant population growth in the St. Louis metropolitan area since about 2010, with most of the gains in the metropolitan area coming in kind of the early 90s up until 2000. At the same time, the city of St. Louis has lost about 28% of its population, while the national economy has grown in population by about 32%. What I'm not showing you on this figure that I think is important to note is that most of the outlying or the adjacent counties to the city of St. Louis have also seen their population either stagnate or in some cases even decline. In the case of St. Louis County, in the last reports, we've even seen some population declines in those counties. So by no means is this, slow growth in the St. Louis metro area directly attributed to the city of St. Louis. It's actually a more broad-based phenomenon that we're seeing in many parts of the region. The notable exception being St. Charles County, which has added population at a pretty steady clip. Obviously, with population growth being relatively slow, that also has played a role in being a really big tailwind for labor force growth. So when we look at labor force growth, these numbers again look very similar to what I showed you with respect to population. So a little bit of an increase kind of due to baby boomers, remaining in the labor force, continuing to work throughout much of this period. So we saw labor force growth numbers that are a bit better than the national average, or a bit better than the population growth numbers. But again, a very similar trend with respect to labor force growth. And then when we turn to employment, the demand for labor has been relatively strong. So we don't see as significant of a drop off within the metropolitan area. So unemployment rates have come down. But if you look at where people are employed based on the location of their employer, overall employment in the city of St. Louis is down by about 17%. Metropolitan area employment's up by about 13%, while national employment's up by about 43% since 1990. So some pretty big gaps relative to the national average with respect to employment growth in the region and in the city relative to the U.S. You can do this for the metropolitan area. I only put a picture on here for the city of St. Louis, but I think it's a great way to really understand, again, what these commuting patterns look like and where jobs are located, and where people are living. So you can see that jobs in the city of St. Louis are really concentrated in that central corridor, with obviously the hospital, standing out here next to the park, as well as the downtown area and that downtown corridor. Well, if you look at the population density, it's much more skewed towards the central and southern portion of the city. And some areas actually adjacent, well, you can see the park clearly has nobody living in it. And so that stands out as a white spot, but you can definitely see how the population and the jobs require, in many cases, pretty long commutes, and difficult transit in order to ultimately hit the job centers that are within the region. If we broaden this out to the entire metropolitan area, what you see relative to other cities that are the size of St. Louis, or the metropolitan areas that are the size of St. Louis, you see a flatter profile with respect to job density than you would expect to see for a city of about 3 million people. Typically, you see a lot of jobs concentrated in certain areas, and then employment and workers also concentrated in those areas. And then as you move further and further out from the city centers, it tends to be much more sparsely populated. In the city of St. Louis, it's much flatter with respect to that density. Looking at income and housing, per capita income gains in the city have been pretty good, in line with the metropolitan area average in many cases. But without the population and employment gains in the region, the aggregate numbers for personal income, and this is nominal, it's not adjusted for inflation here, has only basically doubled since 1990, when the national total personal income has gone up by a magnitude of almost 5 times. So really still seeing, again, per capita gains look pretty good. People are seeing some improvements in their standard of living. But when you look at the number of people ultimately that are in this market, it doesn't lead to kind of the income pool growing at the same rate as it has in the metropolitan area or as it has in the national level. Turning to housing just briefly, housing affordability remains a major challenge across many parts of the country. We've seen housing prices move up pretty sharply. This is data from the American Community Survey, so it's even a bit backward looking. Home values have moved up even in the last year. But what you can see is that relative to incomes, houses are a bit more affordable than the national average. So a house costs about 3.2 times the national median household income in the city of St. Louis, versus about 3.8 times for the US. But when you look at rents, rent growth has been quite strong. My expectation is when we get data for the current year, we'll probably see some of that alleviate, as we have seen a pretty significant delivery of multifamily units. But at this point, rent affordability numbers of just annual rent relative to annual incomes is very much in line with the national average. So, we often think about the region as being a place that has a lot of affordable housing, and that is true, broadly speaking, relative to some other parts of the country. But when you look at things like rents, they are still relatively high given the incomes that people have to afford in the region. Turning to some of the industry trends with respect to employment, I think it's first and foremost worth noting that, if you go back just to 1990, almost 20% of the employment in the St. Louis metropolitan area was in manufacturing. That's declined now to something that's closer to about 10%. A lot of those losses occurred in the city as well as in the county and some other outlying areas. But predominantly what we have today is an economy that's service-based. So almost 90% of employment in the city of St. Louis is in the service providing sectors. And I'm going to dive into the details a little bit more to show you where that is. It's a bit higher than the national average. That's not surprising, again, given that it's an urban center versus a more rural area where you would tend to have higher shares in manufacturing or agriculture and some of those other sectors. When you look at the breakdown by sector, obviously the healthcare sector stands out right away, about a quarter of employment in the city. And this is, again, this is employment not based on where residents are working, but rather where employers in the city are hiring from. So 26% of people who have a job in the city of St. Louis have a job in the healthcare sector. The next largest sectors Again, manufacturing is up there, professional services, finance, education, and food services are the places where the bulk of employment is located within the sector. And now what I want to do is kind of dive down a little deeper to show what these things look like relative to the national average. And it's going to start to show where we have some pretty heavy concentrations of employment. If you're not familiar with a location quotient, the way you interpret a location quotient is basically how big is the share of your overall employment relative to the national share. So if, for example, manufacturing employment in St. Louis is 8%, and the national share is also 8%, you would get a location quotient of 1. If the national share was only 4%, you would get a location quotient of 2, which would mean that the St. Louis area has twice as many people as the national average working in that sector. So right away, you see I put manufacturing on here. You can see the share of people working in manufacturing in the city, a bit lower than the national average, not by a whole lot, but a little bit. We have more people concentrated in finance and insurance. You know, that's obviously some of it's coming from us here at the Fed, with a decent number of people working downtown, as well as some of the other big financial institutions that have offices in the city. Management of companies and enterprises, holding companies, about twice as the national average there. And then you start getting into educational services and healthcare as being two of the big other areas that stand out. And then arts, entertainment, and recreation is the other area that has above average concentrations of employment. At this level, I think it does raise a lot of questions as to like, okay, why are these concentrations what they are? And I can go down to another level of detail. And I think it starts to provide a pretty clear picture of what you probably all think of as some of the major employers in the region. So for example, manufacturing on aggregate, it's a bit lower with the brewery here in the city. Food, beverage, tobacco manufacturing is about 5 times the national average with the number of people working in that sector. Chemical manufacturing is another place where there's a high concentration of people working in the sector, 3 times the national average in that. Again, with financial institutions in the city, about twice the national average, and some of the management company enterprises and securities and investment spaces. And then you start to get to a couple of the really big sectors. So educational services, this is not public sector education. These are private education services, so primarily universities, but almost 4 times the national average. And similarly in hospitals, about 4 times the national average of the share of people employed in the city that work at hospitals. And then the last piece I want to note is just how significant of a concentration of an entertainment district this city really serves. You see 3 times the national average of number of people in the performing arts and spectator sports, and almost 4 and a half times the national average in museums and historical sites. So, you know, this to me paints what I perceive to be a pretty similar, you know, picture when I drive around the city, which is a lot of people working at universities and at hospitals relative to other places. Obviously, the breweries are a big one, and then all of the arts and entertainment venues that we have around the city of St. Louis make up a relatively larger share of employment than we think about from a typical economy. And with that, just kind of turning to the outlook on some of the longer term trends that we're seeing, I'm going to use forecasts from S&P Global here. They have a pretty easy model to follow. A lot of it's based on, you know, kind of current conditions and assumptions that we see going on within the region. But I think it presents a couple of really telling facts when we think about what's going on in the metropolitan area and in the broader economy with respect to population and labor force growth. Before I get to the city numbers, I think it's important to look at the national numbers here and just note that we have demographic headwinds that are starting to come into play. And while we've seen relatively strong population growth over the last couple of years, it is expected that population growth in the United States is going to kind of plateau with respect to growth in the coming years, and is expected to continue to moderate in the coming years even further. So really not a lot of natural population growth that's expected to occur in the United States as our population ages and our net birth rate is negative. Those national factors are compounded even further in the St. Louis metropolitan area, where we not only have a relatively older population and a lower birth rate, but we also have net migration that's in the outward fashion. So that's leading to a St. Louis metropolitan area that's seeing its population relatively stagnant in the last couple of years and expected to grow at a relatively slow pace. And by 2027, S&P Global has the forecast for the metropolitan area population to be flat. So with that taking place at the regional level and at the national level, you know, many of the assumptions that have been baked in with respect to the housing stock, where jobs are being added in the region, the expectation is that the city is going to basically continue along a similar trend that we've seen over the last couple of decades, which is steady declines in population in the region. So, you know, that really is a major headwind when we think about growth for the metropolitan area, for the nation, and ultimately for the city. When you take those numbers to the labor market, I'm skipping labor force here, and I'm really turning into job growth. We see again a really similar trend, which is, you know, first of all, booming job growth in 2021, 2022, and 2023. I had to take 2020 off of here because the losses were so significant, it really dwarfed my chart. But now we're kind of getting to a point where, like I said, job growth is normalizing in 2024, but demand for labor is cooling. And so the growth in the overall labor market is expected to moderate. The U.S. economy in the long run is expected to add somewhere between 100 and 200,000 jobs a month. In the region, again, with lower labor force growth, just not seeing the same level of employment gains taking place here. Businesses that are growing continue to tell me when I'm out and talking to them that it's just really difficult to find workers in certain areas. We're seeing a lot of initiatives taking place around the region to try to boost the you know, better matches for employers and workers so that we can fill these open positions. But it really remains a significant challenge. And again, the baseline forecast from S&P Global has job growth in the metropolitan area basically stagnant as we move into 26 and 27 after some pretty good years of job growth over the last couple of years. So again, this is a baseline that we're looking at now. I think there's a lot of underlying things that are going on in the city that can move us away from this baseline, but I think it's important just to have a historical baseline perspective in mind here. And then turning to personal income, which in a lot of ways is the foundation for overall economic growth and well-being for communities. Per capita numbers look, again, pretty good, with per capita income growth generally about in line, a bit slower than the national average. But with the pool of employment, it leads to ultimately not as much gains in wages and salaries for workers in the region and within the metropolitan area. And as a result of that, you know, forecasts have, you know, per capita, or sorry, nominal aggregate personal income growth in the region running around 2% in 2026 and down to 1.5% in 2027. Given the inflation numbers I showed you a little bit later, you know, this is pretty much flat real income growth in the coming years for the city. In the case of the metropolitan area in the nation, it's still above that 2% inflation number I showed you. So that's still positive real gains in income there. To wrap up, and then I'm happy to get into some discussions. You know, at a really high level, the economy is growing at a healthy pace, inflation's moderating, and these trends are expected to continue. So I think that sends a good foundation for the near term when we think about it. There's always a chance of a recession, and there's risks on the horizon that we always have to be prepared for. But there's no real red flashing signs at this point in time. There's just things that we have to really keep an eye on. Like I mentioned, the regional mix is very similar to the nation. I think that's a really important thing to always have in the back of our minds. There are other places in the country. I'll give you, you know, Memphis, Tennessee, in our Federal Reserve District, significant concentration in transportation. That makes that part of the country much more sensitive to the national business cycle, because as you start to see slowdowns in the goods economy, it hits a place like Memphis a lot harder. In Kentucky, for example, a lot of auto production. So slowdowns in the auto space really end up hitting that area more broadly than they do in the nation. St. Louis is well diversified, and so it has the ability to hedge against kind of sector specific shocks. Again, manufacturing being the big one that hit the economy. Since 1990, we've seen a lot of job losses in that area. This aging population, negative net migration, it causes a lot of challenges for labor force growth and aggregate growth in the region. The upside of it for many is if you are in the labor market and you are looking for work in the region, there are fewer people that you're competing against. So that's generally leading to lower unemployment rates relative to the national average. And so I think we have to always keep in mind what labor force growth looks like, as well as the unemployment rate, when we think about the health of labor markets in the region. Because without a lot of labor force growth, it is easy to make sure that those people who are looking for work can find that work. Like many Midwestern cities, declines in manufacturing have resulted in losses in employment and population declines, stemming from the mid-1980s, 1990s, all the way through to today. St. Louis is no exception to this. I think what makes St. Louis unique in many ways is that in these other metropolitan areas around the Midwest, while their cities were hit hard from the declines in manufacturing and suffered population losses, the inner ring suburbs generally performed well, and they built up housing stock and they saw relatively strong population growth. That's less of a case in the case of the St. Louis metropolitan area. So as a result of that, we have less employment and population density, and that can be quite costly over time. A lot of research has shown that density, employment density, population density leads to these agglomeration effects, quick spillovers and transitions of new technology and diffusion of ideas throughout the economy. And so by having less density in the region, that is always a challenge when we think about what it means for productivity and ultimately per capita income growth going forward. So that is, I think, one place that the St. Louis metropolitan area as a whole is unique to some of these other cities. When we think about what's happening in a place like Detroit or Indianapolis or Louisville, where the surrounding areas adjacent to the city have generally added population at a pretty healthy clip, while the city center may have lost population, as the case in the city of St. Louis as well. We've seen that much more hollowed out, both in the county of St. Louis, Madison, and St. Clair counties as well. And with that, I'm happy to wrap up and take any questions that you all might have.
Great
Well, thank you.
presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. We'll go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead and throw your hand up or hit the hand raised emoji, and I will go ahead and circle through those folks when I see them. Let's see, Paul, I see yours right off the bat.
Yes, and thank you, Charles. A very interesting presentation. So is it, given the net negative migration trend that we're seeing here, is it a safe assumption to say that those areas of our region which are growing at the expense of other areas that are not growing? In other words, we're competing among ourselves as opposed to bringing in from the outside.
I'm going to take a household perspective and say, yes, people are moving within the region to the areas that they like to live in. I think you could take a government perspective, and which I think is where you were going with it, and say municipalities, counties may be competing for workers, residents. I think the other way to look at it is just say households make the decision as to where they want to live and where they want to work. And we are seeing that rotation within the region. Now, that being said, all aggregate population growth has slowed over the years. So yes, there are on net more people leaving the region than coming in.
Thanks.
Okay, and then I think Chair Boyd, you had your hand up next. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was on mute. Charles, thanks for the presentation. I thought that was, quite insightful in terms of, what you had to communicate to us. I won't bore you with the number of questions that I had. I think I wrote down 10 or so, to be perfectly honest. But I'll just kind of start with the high level. So one question I did have, I noticed that there is an exodus from the city of St. Louis to, the surrounding areas, whether the other metro areas. Do you think schools have a hand in that in terms of the local school system in terms of people moving to different communities because of, you know, St. Louis Public Schools or things of that nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the aggregate level, if you look at the migration flows within the metropolitan area, they're westward. So if I look at migration from like St. Louis City is on net adding people from Madison and St. Clair counties in Illinois. And they're losing people westward and they're losing, and then the migration is generally westward speaking. So at a high level, I think that's what I have in the back of my mind. From
Okay,
that
so
point,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, go follow up. Yeah, absolutely.
No, so you so not necessarily that, you know, schools are playing a part of, you know, citizens moving outside the city of St. Louis, but just that they're moving westward because of, you know, housing opportunities.
Yeah, so most economic models point to a few factors for migration. Differences in amenities is one of them, and housing stock being the other big one. Is like how old your housing stock is a big predictor of ultimately how much population growth you're going to see within a county or a region. If you have a relatively older housing stock, it makes it much more costly to, you know, fix those places up. Oftentimes they don't meet modern needs, you know, rooms are smaller, those kind of things. So the size of the housing stock or the age of the housing stock, and then ultimately what some of those amenities look like. Schools being one of them, but measuring school quality there's a lot of endogeneity that goes into that. So I think we have to be careful as to how we think about that.
Yeah, exactly. Another question. One of your slides, I think, I can't recall which one it was. I think St. Louis, I wrote down this question. St. Louis has income growth has been half of the national average and about 2/3 of the state average. You know,
Yeah.
can I get your thoughts on why you think that is?
Yeah, so in the background, the population loss is a big driver of that. So you can see per capita, per person income gains that are in line with the national average or within line with the metropolitan area average. But then with population growth or population declines, it just means that an aggregate is not going to grow as fast. So I was showing, because I thought what would be most relevant for you all is like, what's the stock of income in the region? And that's what that number is giving you. For my own analysis, I often go to per capita numbers as a measure of household well-being. And that gives you a better sense of what that looks like. But for these purposes, I showed you aggregate income numbers as kind of what the overall purchasing power of the community would look like.
And I won't bore you with all my questions, but one other question I had was the workforce. I think you kind of mentioned that you talk to companies regularly. The Fed talks to those companies regularly in terms of their workforce. And what types of jobs are they struggling, you know, to find for their workforces? And how often do you talk to those companies?
Yeah,
Is it
absolutely.
like once every year, every 5 years?
Every couple of months, to be honest
Oh,
with you.
wow.
I mean,
Wow.
for example, I've been around the region giving talks to different chambers of commerce and different business organizations. We have a workforce development roundtable that we'll be having here at the bank in a couple of weeks. So we're always looking to talk to businesses and community leaders in our district to understand what's going on in the economy. As you saw today, some of the data is backward looking. And so businesses and community organizations, state and local governments can provide us kind of boots on the ground, real-time information as to kind of how the economy is evolving. I'm guessing somebody like Paul probably sees, you know, tax revenue numbers quicker than they get posted on the website. So he'll know when things might be changing on in those areas. So that's why we talk to businesses. With respect to shortages of workers, what I'm hearing are two things. It's generally easier to find workers. There's more applicants per position when they're posting, but in the healthcare space, it continues to be hard to find workers. Manufacturing, there's structural challenges, still difficult to find workers in those areas. And then in the construction space is the other area that we see a lot of just major challenges in finding workers in those areas. So it's a combination of, from a cyclical standpoint, it's a bit easier to hire. From a structural standpoint, there's still some really big mismatches between the skills that people have and sometimes where there's long-term needs for jobs and we just don't have the people being trained in those areas. And there's a lot of great things going on around the community to meet those needs. So, I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about that, but, you know, great things are happening in that space, I think, to meet those needs. And it's really important given again, the labor force isn't growing. So it's not like you can just sit here and expect, well, more people to move to the area and those people are going to be able to fill those needs. I think as a community, we've seen how our population's been relatively stagnant. And that means that if you are going to fill the needs, it often means training people, finding people who are disconnected from the labor force and getting those people into the workforce so that they can fill those positions.
All right, and then let's see, I believe Vice Chair Nguyen, I think I saw your hand up next.
Great question, Lorenzo. You answered ask a couple of mine on. One of the first image you showed actually really triggered me a little bit about the 154,000 people who migrate into the city for employment, right? Do you have a breakdown of those demographics of like who, what kind of jobs do they go to, what household size they are, what are the incomes? Because I keep coming back to how do we grow our population and create amenities and housing for them? As a young family of 4, my struggle with a old St. Louis house is to upkeep, but also I love St. Louis, but I need to grow, right? Like, but it's so hard to find housing that is affordable, but also like within the city limits. So I'm just curious, do you have more kind of demographic information behind like the employees that go into the city and what kind of families that we could be attracting into our into the city, right? Because I just think about like that population growth.
Yep. So, so the source of the data for that migration is it's data from the Census Bureau where they match essentially employers' payroll records with addresses on workers' W-2s. So you know the occupation and you know where they live. And so you can look at it by occupation and wage, which won't give you, it'll give you a proxy for income. It won't give you kind of racial compositions or anything like that, but it will give you an idea of what jobs people are coming into the city for, what jobs people are leaving for, and you can get all that. I'm happy to share with you the website on the Census Bureau. It's super fun to play around with. At least for me, it is. Maybe it'll be painful for you, but I love it. So that's a great source for that information. And yeah, housing availability remains a key challenge in many areas, both those areas that are growing as well as those where the population is stagnant. And it's often trying to meet that need from the missing middle housing. Part of what's happening in that space is the cost of construction has gone up pretty significantly over the last couple of years. And so just the price point in which the price of a new house today, a new home construction, is much more comparable to an existing family home than it's ever been before. So, the economics make it very difficult to build what we would consider to be broad-based affordable housing. What we see going on around the country is those areas that have increased their housing supply, regardless of what kind of housing it is, they've seen kind of rent growth moderate and home prices remain at a more affordable level. So, in my own view, it's about just trying to expand the supply of housing in many different ways. And you're not always going to be able to hit the target audiences right away. But what we do see in the data is that areas where the supply of housing is very inelastic and not flexible, even when positive things happen to a region, it's often not met with population growth. It's just met with growth in housing prices. And we see that across the coastal areas very significantly, which is, we would have seen a lot more migration, probably even out of this region and out to a place like California if it was easier to build houses in California. So we always have to worry about those same kind of issues happening with development in the city or anywhere. And that if housing doesn't meet the needs, you could end up seeing housing prices go up faster than even the inflow of people coming into the area.
I know a lot of part of the work that we do is at affordable housing. Do you feel like there's studies out there comparing the cost of development between like the city and other counties near us? Like, is the cost of development cheaper, relatively the same? Are there more barriers in the city in terms of development than there are in other counties? I feel like there's a lot of new construction happening in other places in South County, West County, even North County, and not as much here in the city. And I'm curious as to is the development cost the same, or is there more barriers in our city to do that? Have you had
That's a-
studies on that?
That is a great question. I have only seen estimates of kind of that type of cost at the metropolitan area level, and at a metropolitan area level, St. Louis is kind of in the middle of the pack. You know, from talking to developers around the region, what I can tell you is that we have a lot of different rules with respect to land use, and that does make development tricky. You know, that's an area that shows up a lot, is just kind of what the rules of the road are for different parts of the metropolitan area as a whole. But if I see anything, I'll definitely share it. It's a great question.
Okay, and then I believe the next hand I saw up was Danielle. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Charles, thanks so much for your presentation. Very helpful and insightful. My question, I'm curious on how the Fed is thinking about some of the short-term potential economic shocks. Usually we see the election sometimes can signal and shift the economic sort of outlook of a region, of the nation. So I'm curious on what you're seeing there with some of the more short-term events, life events that are happening in the country, and how that may impact revenue, but also in the longer term, as we're thinking about potentiality of a recession, how sooner or longer that may be, which could obviously very much impact revenues, key revenues coming through the city.
Yeah. Okay. So on the recession front, if I shared with you my generic economic outlook slide, I have a recession probability chart. And what I can tell you is that recessions are rarely predicted. So in my baseline, I tend to not put the recessions in any type of forecast because they're incredibly hard to predict. It was over 50% a chance of a recession last year from professional forecasters, and we saw really strong growth. So I don't see that in my baseline. I think where some of the risks to the outlook fall, you know, we do hear from businesses that election uncertainty is definitely playing a role in kind of what their investment plans look like. You know, that's probably going to resolve itself here in the coming months. So, you know, that'll be to the side. Policy uncertainty is kind of very firm specific. So what we hear from business contacts and from community members is it maybe isn't the election as a whole, but rather very specific pieces of legislation that they're looking at. And that uncertainty is elevated because you've got the Tax Cut and Job Acts expiring next year. You've got the Farm Bill that hasn't been renewed yet. So we hear from ag contacts that those are big issues. So it's more policy specific. One of the areas I think that is kind of a risk to the outlook is on the housing front. Housing inflation is still elevated, and we've significantly underbuilt housing in many parts of the country over the years. So that continues to be a pressure on many places in the community. And that's not the kind of thing that you can shy away from. And if the share of our budgets increasingly goes more and more to housing, that becomes costly for other sectors of the economy. So I think that's one area that we have to really keep a close eye on. And housing policy ultimately is local. It's a matter of where you can and cannot build. So that's I think something that I point down to and say it's something that, you know, local communities have to keep a very close eye on, is making sure that they're meeting the need in the community for housing.
Thank you so much.
All right, Jason, I saw your hand up next. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Hey, Charles, thanks for the presentation. It was great. I just have a quick question. With 17%, just going based on, you know, my notes and your slides, looks like we have 17% fewer jobs than we did in 1990. And with looks like the net outward migration from the city is due to the lack of economic opportunities. So it's these loss of jobs over the last over the last 30 or 40 years has really produced, in some ways, and answers some of the questions earlier, in many ways has produced the net migration out of the city. So because of that, I guess, have you done, or do we know if there's any research on why companies are leaving? I mean, is that data that's ever captured anywhere? Because it seems to me and it seems by your presentation, that's the biggest driver, or one of the biggest drivers why people leave the city, is there's not economic opportunity.
So I mean, there's a few things that are going on in the background. I mean, if you go through, you know, at a longer history, we have issues of racism and segregation that have clearly played out in how our communities have have formed today. And I don't think we can move away from that and say that there's a lot of other factors that go into why people have moved to where they've moved to. With respect to employment, there's two factors that are at play here. So one is I was showing you where the employment of firms in the city. And there's two things that have gone on there. One is that manufacturing employment has declined on the aggregate. As a result of that, employment of firms in the city has declined, and there was a concentration of manufacturing firms. What employment is concentrated now in the city is in the healthcare space, as well as in the tour, I'll call it broadly speaking, the tourism and hospitality space. And so some of it is a sectoral shift in that where growth has occurred in, for example, in some of the financial services areas and some of the professional services areas, those firms have typically located out in the suburban areas, and that's been the case across the country. The decline in manufacturing can account for a significant portion of the decline in job opportunities or the decline in employment within the city of St. Louis as a whole. So industry mix is a big player here, as well as kind of household preferences as to where they want to live and who they want to live near, determining what migration patterns are ultimately going to look like.
Jason, did you have
Right.
any other questions?
No, I think that was helpful. I just wanted to, I just wanted to understand. It seemed like your slides were, kind of
I took
pushing
a
toward
very,
that
and
the
I-
outward migration from the city
Yep.
is very much due to, or in part due to the lack of economic opportunity.
Yeah, and if we dig deeper into the data, what you can start to look at is like what industries had the bulk of employment, where were the concentrations of employment in, say, 1990? Have those sectors nationally added jobs or lost jobs? What sectors have added jobs, and are those relative concentrations in other areas? And what you'd start to see in that case is the areas where the city had some concentrations in 1990 are sectors that generally grew slower than the national average and were not adding employment at the same level. Notable exception being healthcare, where across the metropolitan area, much of our job growth is coming from the healthcare sector.
Sure. So from that, do you, in your just your opinion, your professional opinion, I would think that increased economic opportunity within the city limits would be a draw, or certainly, a draw for net new migration into the city limits. I do find that it's anecdotal, of course, that folks do want to work close to where they live and live close to where they work. So if we're a revenue council looking forward, I think, increased economic opportunity in the city could certainly, and will certainly help. I just want to get your thoughts, your opinion on that.
Yeah, so I would say this, and for any of you all that commuting is a cost and a tax that we all pay to get to our jobs in the morning, or go home at night. So the commuting costs are definitely something that determines people's location preferences. Reductions in commuting costs are always a way to attract people to new locations and to new job opportunities. When you think back to where kind of the employment density is and where maybe the population, we'll call it the opportunity population, those that are kind of marginally attached to the workforce and have the opportunity to potentially stay in the city and find jobs, there may not be job opportunities in those communities. So I showed you the map of the city, and we see population density in the north side of the city is relatively low relative to the south side of the city. You also don't see jobs concentrated in those areas. So now you're thinking, how does person X that's living in one location get to the job that exists? Do they have a car? Can they afford a car? Is there public transportation that's available? All of these real practical questions show up on a day-to-day basis. And then again, what are the housing costs? And is housing affordable? Are rents affordable for people to take these jobs? So there's a lot of factors that ultimately come into play, and it's not always pure distance measure. It's a factor of many of these things. That's how you get to someplace, and ultimately what it's going to cost you to make that trade-off of your rent versus your commute time.
Great, thanks.
All right, and Sam, I think you had your hand up next.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and it's a sobering one all around, and largely a story of stagnation and some decline. But you mentioned that when you look at the future in the city, and particularly with things like job growth and wage growth, there are some potential bright spots. What do you see as kind of the best bets for population, job, and wage growth in the city? And areas where you think St. Louis really needs to double down to reverse some of these trends?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So let me try to take what I showed you and put a bright spot behind it, right? So we have a fixed boundary in the St. Louis city and the metropolitan area. The more and more people you add into those boundaries, the more the resources that are there have to get divvied up. So it's just because our economic growth is slow or our population is stagnant doesn't necessarily mean that for those people who are still here, they don't have opportunities. And in many cases they do, which is the whole reason that they're still here. So when I look at incomes relative to the overall housing costs, they look pretty good. When I look at per capita income growth, it looks pretty good. So from a household standpoint, those that are deciding to stay in the community are seeing a vibrant community, and they're seeing opportunities that exist, and that's the reason that they're staying here. It's that we have some of the times these national shocks, such as the decline in manufacturing that occurred, that do take opportunities away. And for those people who are looking for new opportunities, unfortunately, they haven't been matched up to those right spots yet, and so they think they have to look elsewhere. So you talk to high school kids and they don't realize that the job of their dreams is right around the corner, and instead they think they have to move to Atlanta to get that job. So some of it's just about making sure that we align employers and universities go down to the elementary school levels, in some cases, the middle school levels, and align students and kids' knowledge with the opportunities of the jobs that exist. Because at the aggregate level, yeah, it shows a shrinking macro economy, a shrinking regional economy. And for a city government, that can be very problematic, and it creates a lot of challenges for you all here. But at the household level, it may not always look bad, which is why we're all still here. If it was that bad, we would all continue to leave until we had the right ratio of people to resources. And so you see other cities that are maybe 700,000, 1 million people, they're growing really fast, and they're dealing with different problems, which is housing's too expensive, their commute times are even longer, and their cost of living is going up faster than their incomes. They may not be happy with that either, but they're sticking it around. So we're on kind of the flip side of the coin. And at a government and administrative level, it's quite challenging, but at the household level, it has different levers at play. You know, I'm happy with where my kids are at school. I love the amenities that are in the region, so I choose to stay here.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chuck. I think that we all found that so helpful. I think that there's a lot for us to think on. After we say goodbye to you guys, there's going to be an opportunity for this group to discuss amongst itself. If through that there are some additional drill down questions that we have, would it be okay for us to send those your guys' way for consideration, if that's something you guys are able to help us dig into a little bit more? Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, I'll be out in the region talking to businesses and community leaders. So if there's topics that come up that you all have questions about and you're looking for more insights, please pass them along. And our reports, we try to publish everything that we have on our website. So our Beige Book report comes out tomorrow. That's where you'll get a summary of what I've been hearing from businesses and community leaders across our district. So you can check that out when it comes out tomorrow. And those come out every couple of months. So we'll try our best to continue to provide real-time updates on the regional economy going forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both again so much, Chuck and Laura, for your time and your knowledge today. And certainly if there's any additional questions that we want to kick your way. I don't think that we'll be shy at all about doing that. So thank you so very much, and we'll give you back the rest of your afternoon, and then we'll pivot to having our own internal mulling over of the great information that we just received.
Sounds good. And I'll pass the slides over to Laura and she'll make sure you guys get a copy of them.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, wanted to open it up for any observations or takeaways. Of course, it was a lot of information to receive at once. So didn't know if there was anything that anybody wanted to highlight or share with the rest of the group or throw out there.
I think that one thing that I hope that over time that comes from this is that, well, I think that encouraging economic growth in the city, I think that's going to be a huge benefit to the city. I think that has to be part of our however many tiered approach to stabilizing the region and future growth, revenue growth for the city. Yeah, just wanted to mention that. I think that his slides bore that out. You know, it's unfortunate we've lost a lot of, for all the reasons he mentioned, but also that we lost the manufacturing. But I do think, you know, over time, I don't know how we incentivize. I know we have a lot of biotech going on in that central corridor, and we have the healthcare space. We have a lot of startups happening. So I don't know if we can, consider some increased incentives. But yeah, and I don't know if this is the time for any of this, but I think that this really helps solidify some of the issues that we're having that I see that we're having in the city, and that is economic opportunity has been waning since 1990, and it parallels the net migration outside from the city out. It parallels that. So, yep.
Yeah, Casey, and I was intrigued by when he talked about population density. It's like the chicken and egg, situation. I've always been intrigued by, you go to other metro areas and the population density is certainly higher than what you see in the St. Louis metropolitan, in the city of St. Louis. So, to get our population density, up or higher, do we need to, create, job opportunities, or do we need to increase housing? And that's what I mean by the chicken and egg approach in terms of what do we need to focus on first in terms of, getting jobs or getting businesses back to the city. So then we can build houses, or do we need houses to encourage people to move back and then businesses will come?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems to me we would need both, but yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know which one comes first. I definitely think economic opportunity will bring people back into the city, but so can affordable housing, which I know we're working on and we need to continue to work on. So I don't know. Yeah.
And I was also curious, Casey, I think we can also drill down on this and ask one of the questions I had about 10 questions, but I didn't want to monopolize the time. But, my question was, is there any correlation between the low rent associated with St. Louis and the decline in income growth and the exodus of citizens to other metro areas? So, or, is it a result of do we have low rent levels because of the exodus to other metro areas in hopes that people will, tend to stay in the St. Louis metro area? So I was kind of intrigued by that as well. And to a general question, how does the Fed feel? I mean, they are a player, or they are right in the city of St. Louis. How do they feel about this exodus and the state of the economy of the city of St. Louis? What are their thoughts and their true thoughts? And do they have information that they could share that would on what we need to do as a city to kind of increase the economy, increase housing, increase businesses, and things of that nature? Because they certainly give us a lot of statistics, but just in general feel on, I don't know if they can do that. How do they feel?
I actually wanted to ask that same question, Lorenzo. I wanted to say, look, what do you guys think we should do? Lay out a plan for us. Not that we would have to take it, but I was curious to think that being an economist, what was his thoughts on, some of the actions we could take to stabilize and encourage growth in all the areas that we discussed. economic opportunities, housing stock, all of that. So he kind of gave us some of that, but I thought that was a great question too.
I mean,
We
he
could have
brought up
asked.
two different things in terms of like what people looks for in terms of neighborhoods, right? I work a lot with like neighborhood stabilization officer. We talk about like housing stock and amenities, and I'm curious. I know this is going to be a future meeting of ours where we talk about like where our public dollars and ARPA dollars are being spent right now. But it might be really interesting to kind of see where our investments are and also like what other opportunities we're leveraging to actually increase our neighborhoods, right? Stability, because a lot of neighborhoods are losing a lot of population and folks want to move into areas that do have a lot of amenities and strong infrastructure. I get complaints all the time, like why our streets why are they're not fixed? Why do we have missing trees and missing light poles? So like, what are we doing with the infrastructure? What are the dollars that are being spent on so that we can see how other dollars can be attracted to the area? I want to go back to that the question I had about development because we have such difficult time doing development because we make it hard. Like the city of St. Louis make it hard for development to happen compared to other places around us. So we are competing with other cities and our other municipalities because we just have a lot more red tape. The works that I do with developers, like I know for a fact, like it's just more red tape. So it's easier to go to another city than to do business in city. So what are we doing about that as well? So I think like as we look at to where our public investments are, but what are ways that we can improve? And I know this is a future topic of ours is modernization, right? Like how are we making it easier for people to get their, business license or, their permits, like instead of just jumping through a bunch of hoops. I think that that's part of the conversations. How are we making it easier for folks to develop so that we are attracting people back into the city and building, new homes so that folks, not everyone wants an old home, right? So like, how are we investing? And then what are ways that we're making it easier to do business in the city?
Sure. Nancy, I know you had your hand up for a minute, took it down, didn't know if you did want to wait or if that was just an accidental.
I'm gonna wait till another time.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I will note is the topic of so we certainly have the January topic of the meeting will be city modernization and development. But we also have for the November topic, city business and workforce development, retention and growth. So in light of some of the more, what was the phrase Mr. Gascon used today? The household focus is I think the phrase he said. In addition to all those topics, we could also expand to doing a little bit of a focus on some of the more like the housing pieces as well, or some of those other topics that were generally discussed today about being more things that your average household is going to be thinking about on day to day, in addition to the topics of driving city business, industry, workforce development, recruitment, and retention. So we can take that more holistic approach to November if that's something everybody would like to do. Seeing a few heads nodding.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Okay.
I don't know if this is on your radar, Casey, but it'd be great to kind of tap in. A lot of times we think about, we do have a lot of institutions here in our city, WashU, SLU, I'm curious as to like what Regional Business Council thinks about like the brain drain and how are we, keeping the young talent that are being educated in our region. If there's any workforce, right? There was a comment about like, instead of moving to Atlanta, there's opportunities for you to invest in here. I'm just curious as to what their efforts are and how are they, kind of trying to keep those brains in our region as opposed to, kind of combating that as well.
For sure. Yeah, I know there's a lot of disparate efforts happening, across the city too. So it sounds like that can be part of the November focus as well, as trying to get a good sense of what that landscape looks like and who's focusing on what and how the thinking around that's happening. Okay, Nancy, you had your hand up again. Go ahead.
So I, as someone who has to deal with this on a daily basis, I think it would be helpful, given the kind of questions that you're all asking, that we try to put some information together for people before you come as to where we were and what's been modernized already. Not that you all don't know, but I think it could change the conversation so we don't reinvent the wheel of what's already been done to make things better. Because at the end of the day, we are making everything putting everything, I don't use the right terms, and people who know me on this call know I'm not a techie. However, we have moved most of everything to online paying your bills, online personnel issues, online many other issues and systems, and making systems across the city. But that's not necessarily endearing us to the business community to move into the city to create more wealth in the city. All the things we're trying to do create wealth, but we have to bring business back. And I know along with RBC, it would be good to hear what GSL, Greater St. Louis Inc. is also thinking. And there are some Hispanic business council, not Hispanic, not some. There are a number of ethnic business councils that may or may not be connected to the RBC and GSL. But we want to hear, like, maybe they have a one-pager on what they're trying to do to bring business in. And a lot of what Mr. Gaskin said talks about big businesses. And a lot of what we're seeing coming back in is small or middle businesses. There's not someone coming in with 700 or 1,000 factory jobs. They're coming with a couple of hundred, or they're opening a company and they're bringing 50 or 100 positions in. That's all good, but that's not what people in general think when you say we're bringing businesses back. And I think that has to be part of the discussion, is like, what level of businesses are we bringing in, and how are we helping to how are we using the business community to help us do that as a city, because they're going to create long-term revenue for the city in a way that other smaller businesses will create some long-term revenue, but not at the higher levels. Like, we don't have as many people at InBev as we did when I moved here 20 years ago. We've just diversified a lot. And we also didn't really talk about what kind of jobs are we preparing people for. Healthcare is a big field, but what does that mean? Like, and are those jobs really paying a living wage that add to the economy? So I think we have some ability to give people some one-pagers from a governmental standpoint, which I think would be helpful to you all. So when we do the conversation, we don't have to spend as much time on that as we might in another time. So just some thoughts. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Jason, let's see. I think you have your hand up. You went off mute. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Well, what I would put forward is Chair Boyd, Vice Chair Nguyen. I know there's been a lot of great thinking and suggestions today on building out the scope of a few upcoming meetings, different types of presenters to think about, different sorts of informational resources to make available in advance to that. If you both would be amenable, I'm happy to work with you guys to sort of coalesce all of that, and then we can share sort of the initial vision in light of all that feedback with the broader group, and see if anyone else has any additional suggestions to throw into the mix. Does that sound like a good approach?
Yes, that sounds great. Yes.
Great. Okay, and then once we get the slide deck from the feds, I'll share that. I'll also see about getting a copy of that beige book report, since there was a bit of interest in this group about that. And then in addition, what I've also been doing is taking a little bit of notes during the presentation. Happy to share those with you all as a separate resource from the minutes from this meeting too, in case it's helpful for anybody in processing what we heard today.
Thank you, Casey.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Let's see, Ryan, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. When you're mentioning about disseminating the PowerPoint slides, I wonder if, especially as time goes on and we have sort of a larger body of work and documents, if it might be a good idea to have a centrally located file, something like a Google Drive or some other Dropbox that had the documents, sort of categorized with one place. I know I have one going, but it might be easier for everyone instead of trying to corral them all in one place to have one centrally located spot. So that'd be maybe a suggestion.
Absolutely. That's pretty easy to do, and I can go ahead and get that created this week.
That was easy. Thank you.
And I will tell you, Casey, we are restricted. If you, I'll probably have to give you my personal email.
Okay.
We are restricted from using and commenting on Google Drives at Stifel just because of security purposes, unfortunately.
Got
So
it.
I'll have to pass along my personal email to you so that I can do some of that information.
Great. Thanks for the heads up. I'll make sure that I get that I think I have your personal email, so I will go ahead and I'll get access on the Google Drive to that right
Okay.
off the gate. And I'll circle back with you to see if you have any issues in accessing it. But thank you so much for flagging that.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else anybody wants to elevate? All right. Well, it is 4:54 p.m. Is there a motion and a second to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
I make the motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll second it.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposition? Any abstentions? No. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks.
Take care.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.